September 1943. Marcus Island, Central Pacific Ocean.
Dawn breaks across an expanse of water so vast it seems to swallow the horizon itself.
A solitary runway cuts through volcanic rock. Japanese ground crews stand alert.
The morning air carries the familiar rumble of Mitsubishi S6M0s, the aircraft that had terrorized American carrier formations for nearly 2 years.
The pilots who flew them were the elite of Japanese naval aviation.
These were men who had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision. Men who had turned the opening months of the Pacific War into a relentless Japanese offensive. In the cockpits of Zeros, they were nearly untouchable.
But on this September morning, something unprecedented was about to occur. Across the horizon, a formation of American Grumman F6F Hellcats approached Marcus Island.
These aircraft looked foreign to Japanese eyes, heavier, bulkier, less elegant than the graceful Zero. American pilots had long called the Zero the finest fighter in the world.
That assessment, born from hard experience and countless engagements, seemed unquestioned fact by 1943.
When these new American machines appeared, some Japanese pilots did not hesitate to express their contempt.
They laughed at the Hellcat.
They called it an overweight failure.
A clumsy American attempt to copy what could never be copied.
The Zero represented something sacred in the Japanese military consciousness, the superiority of skilled artistry, of warrior spirit refined through dedication and discipline. A single Zero pilot, properly trained, was worth 10 American pilots in inferior machines.
This was the doctrine that had been beaten into every Japanese naval aviator since the war began. This was the belief that would sustain Japanese naval aviation through the coming years. But belief, no matter how deeply held, could not withstand what the Hellcat was about to unleash. The story of the F6F Hellcat's emergence must be understood through the lens of what came before.
The Grumman F4F Wildcat had been America's primary carrier-based fighter when Pearl Harbor shattered the pretense of peace. The Wildcat was a stubby, ungainly aircraft. By any objective measure, it was inferior to the Zero. It was slower. It was less maneuverable.
It climbed more slowly.
In the opening months of the 1942, American pilots and Wildcats had been slaughtered by Zero pilots who possessed not only superior aircraft but also superior combat experience drawn from years of undeclared war in China. The Wildcat pilots had learned to survive through discipline, not dominance.
They learned that the Zero, magnificent though it was in maneuverability, possessed fundamental vulnerabilities. Its structure was fragile. Its fuel tanks lacked self-sealing capability.
Above 300 miles per hour, the Zero's control surfaces became sluggish and difficult to manipulate.
American pilots learned to dive away from combat.
They learned to fight at speeds where their aircraft retained control authority while their opponents struggled. They learned to shoot with deflection, to calculate lead and fire with precision rather than relying on maneuverability to generate firing solutions. These lessons, purchased with blood and written in pilot accounts and combat reports, reached the desks of Grumman aircraft engineers in Bethpage, New York. In June 1941, with the contract for the new XF6F1 prototype already signed, Grumman's chief designer Jake Swerbel and his team began construction of what they believed would be the Wildcat's successor. The original design specified a Wright 2600 Cyclone engine, a proven power plant with 1,700 horsepower.
This would have been sufficient.
It would have created an aircraft marginally superior to the Zero. But then came tactical analysis.
On April 22, 1942, a young officer named Lieutenant Commander Archibald Jackson visited the Grumman facility.
With him came freshly compiled data from the Pacific War.
Reports from pilots. Combat assessments.
Frame-by-frame analysis of dogfights where American pilots had been forced to accept defeat by aircraft they could not match in maneuverability or performance. Jackson and the Grumman engineers made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the air war. Instead of accepting the Wright engine, they would install the Pratt & Whitney 2800 Double Wasp, a twin-row radial producing 2,000 horsepower. The aircraft would be heavier than the Zero. Much heavier. Its fuel consumption would be higher. Its range would be shorter.
But it would be faster.
And most critically, it would be designed to survive damage that would vaporize a Zero.
The engineers calculated that a 25% increase in horsepower would allow them to execute their complete vision. The new Hellcat would have armor plates surrounding the pilot, 212 pounds of steel and protection. It would have self-sealing fuel tanks designed to close automatically when punctured. It would have 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each capable of firing 400 rounds per minute. The Hellcat's wings would be designed for strength rather than maneuverability, capable of sustaining dive speeds that would tear the wings off a zero. When the F6F first flew on July 30, 1942, the pilots who flew the test flights were astonished. The machine responded with immediacy. The controls remained light and responsive even at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. The engine was smooth, powerful, and reliable. The visibility from the cockpit was excellent. The pilot position had been moved higher in the fuselage, giving a commanding view of the combat arena below. By October 1942, production F6F aircraft began rolling off the assembly line at a rate that exceeded even the optimistic projections of Navy planners. The first operational Hellcats arrived at naval air stations in the Hawaiian Islands by early 1943. American pilots who transitioned from Wildcats to Hellcats experienced something psychologically transformative. For the first time since the war began, they were not defending against superior aircraft. For the first time, they were flying machines that possessed genuine advantages over the Zero. The Hellcat's hydraulically actuated landing gear was wide-set, robust, and forgiving. The wing-folding mechanism worked smoothly. The engine was a marvel of reliability. Twin-row radials required constant attention and expertise, but this engine seemed almost foolproof in its operation. Most critically, the Hellcat could execute maneuvers that would snap the wings off a Zero. It could dive at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour and pull out with authority. It could initiate rolls and maintain control through aggressive turns that would have rendered the Zero nearly uncontrollable. Japanese pilots who had laughed at the Hellcat's arrival were about to encounter a reality that would transform their understanding of warfare itself. The combat operations of the F6F Hellcat began not with fanfare but with a combat debut that would soon become legend. On September 1, 1943, aircraft from Fighting Squadron 5 aboard the USS Yorktown were vectored toward Marcus Island to neutralize Japanese air opposition. 4 days later, on September 5, 1943, a rookie naval aviator named Ensign Robert Duncan found himself in his cockpit, rolling into an attack on Japanese aircraft attempting to intercept American bombers. Duncan's second engagement of that morning would become historically significant, though neither he nor his opponent recognized its importance at the moment the bullets stopped flying. Japanese warrant officer Toshiyuki Sueda had achieved 9 confirmed aerial victories, primarily against American F4F Wildcats. Sueda was a trained killer. His technique was refined through experience. He would lure his American opponent into a vertical climb, inducing the Wildcat to stall at altitude. At the moment of stall, the American aircraft would fall away helplessly. Sueda would follow, position himself behind his opponent, and methodically destroy them with concentrated bursts from his 20mm cannons. Sueda spotted what he believed was another F4F Wildcat. The silhouette seemed correct. The size approximated what he expected. Sueda initiated his proven tactic. He pulled his Zero into a vertical climb, bleeding away speed, waiting for the American pilot to follow into the stall trap. Duncan, in his F6F Hellcat, was piloting an aircraft that Sueda's instincts did not yet comprehend. The Hellcat possessed a 2,000 horsepower engine that seemed to defy the laws of physics at altitude. The controls remained responsive even as speed bled away. Duncan followed Sueda's climb without hesitation, not from naivete, but because his aircraft possessed the performance to pursue a maneuver that would have been suicidal in a Wildcat. When Sueda reached the point of stall, his Zero hung momentarily in the sky, nearly motionless relative to the earth below. Duncan's Hellcat still possessed sufficient airspeed to maintain control. The American pilot squeezed the trigger of his 6 machine guns. The concentration of fire was overwhelming. Sueda's Zero, designed for minimum weight and maximum maneuverability, disintegrated. The fragile fuselage could not withstand the impact of multiple .50 caliber rounds. Sueda died in his aircraft. Duncan landed aboard the Yorktown unaware that he had just killed one of the most accomplished Japanese pilots in the Pacific. The engagement lasted less than 60 seconds. For Duncan, it was merely his second aerial victory.
For the history of aerial warfare, it was a seismic event. A Japanese ace with 9 confirmed victories had been killed by a pilot flying an aircraft that Japanese military culture had learned to despise.
The arrival of the F6F Hellcat coincided with a transformation in American fighter tactics.
The radar-directed fighter intercept system allowed American carrier task forces to position their Hellcats with surgical precision.
Ground control vectored fighters toward incoming Japanese formations at precise altitudes and headings.
American pilots did not have to search for combat, they were guided directly to it. This represented a revolutionary concept in air warfare.
Japanese pilots, trained in an older tradition of aerial combat, relied on visual searches and improvised tactics.
American pilots were learning to follow systematic procedures, to rely on radio direction from controllers aboard ships with sophisticated radar. This procedural approach lacked the romantic appeal of individual combat skill, but it proved devastatingly effective.
More fundamentally, the Hellcat revealed a harsh truth about modern warfare.
Speed in armor and firepower could be mass-produced. Individual skill, no matter how refined, could not overcome the weight of industrial superiority applied with systematic efficiency. Each Hellcat that rolled off the assembly line at Bethpage incorporated the lessons of hundreds of combat engagements. Each aircraft was more lethal than the last as design iterations incorporated field intelligence and combat reports. By 1943, Grumman was producing the F6F at a rate that exceeded 600 aircraft per month.
Japanese aircraft production, dependent on smaller facilities and less efficient production methods, could not match this output.
The Zero was being built in factories scattered across Japan, each with slightly different tolerances and specifications.
The Hellcat was being built on assembly lines optimized for consistency and speed.
Japanese pilots increasingly recognized what was happening. The men who had trained with the greatest intensity, who had devoted years to mastering the Zero's capabilities, who had achieved expertise through concentration and discipline, these men were being systematically destroyed by American pilots who had trained for a fraction of the time but were flying aircraft that compensated for any deficiency in human skill with mechanical superiority. Saburo Sakai, Japan's third-ranking ace with 64 confirmed aerial victories credited after the war, was one of the first to perceive this reality. In early 1944, after recovering from injuries that had left him partially blind in one eye, Sakai was assigned as a flight instructor. He worked with Japan's newest generation of pilots, young men who had graduated from abbreviated training programs compressed from years to months. The contrast between his own experience and that of his students horrified him. Sakai, like all pre-war Japanese naval aviators, had undergone extensive training. Selection had been ruthlessly selective. Out of 1,500 applicants in 1937, only 70 had been accepted into pilot training. Of those 70, only 25 graduated. Training consumed years. A typical pre-war Japanese pilot arrived at his operational squadron with approximately 700 hours of flying experience. This was real mastery, hundreds of hours of practice in aircraft, developing reflexive skill and intuitive understanding. By 1944, the training system had collapsed. The selective process that had once rejected 95 out of 100 applicants had reversed. The military now accepted nearly everyone. Training lasted months instead of years. Newly graduated pilots arrived at operational squadrons with 200 hours of flying experience, a fraction of what their predecessors possessed. Sakai's memoir, published after the war, described the impossible situation instructors faced. Flight training accidents became daily occurrences. Fire engines and ambulances raced down runways constantly, extracting pilots from wrecked aircraft after clumsy takeoffs or landing accidents. The pressure to produce pilots in quantity had completely overwhelmed any concern for quality. The first time Sakai encountered an F6F Hellcat in June 1944, he performed his best maneuvers. Loops, rolls, splits. Every aerobatic trick refined over 200 previous combats. The Hellcat followed him with apparent casualness, executing the same maneuvers with a heaviness that suggested the American pilot barely needed to exert himself. Sakai survived only because the American pilot made a mistake. The American had forgotten to jettison his belly fuel tank before commencing aggressive maneuvering.
The drag from the tank degraded the Hellcat's performance just enough to allow Sakai to escape.
In his autobiography, Sakai captured the psychological devastation of that encounter. The Hellcat followed easily, almost casually. "I survived only because the American pilot made an error." That moment encapsulated everything that had changed in the Pacific Air War. Superior individual skill was no longer sufficient.
The machines mattered now.
They mattered enormously. And the American machines were superior in every significant metric.
The Marianas Turkey Shoot, industrial warfare reaches its apotheosis.
On June 19, 1944, in the skies west of the Mariana Islands, the transformation became absolute and inescapable. The Imperial Japanese Navy had committed 9 fleet carriers to what they believed would be a decisive offensive.
The carriers launched over 430 aircraft at American task forces. Japanese commanders believed, or perhaps hoped, that their pilots possessed sufficient skill to overcome their lack of numerical superiority. They believed that warrior spirit could triumph over industrial capacity. They were wrong. Task Force 58 deployed approximately 900 aircraft. The American pilots averaged over 500 hours of flight training before entering combat.
The Japanese pilots averaged well under 250 hours of flight training. Many of the most recently assigned pilots had received only 40 hours of actual flying time.
These were not merely less experienced pilots.
These were barely trained aviators, thrust into combat situations that exceeded their capacity to process and survive.
On June 19, 1944, American radar picked up the approaching Japanese formations at ranges exceeding 150 miles.
American pilots were vectored into position, climbing to altitudes and headings calculated to maximize their advantages. They awaited the Japanese with the methodical patience of hunters who have prepared their trap with precision.
When the Japanese aircraft arrived, what followed was not a battle.
It was a slaughter.
Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vreshu, from the USS Lexington, found himself in a formation of approximately 50 Japanese dive bombers approaching the American fleet.
In 8 minutes, Vreshu shot down 6 enemy aircraft using only 360 rounds of ammunition.
60 rounds per kill.
A single magazine per aircraft destroyed. When Vreshu landed aboard the Lexington and stepped out of his cockpit, grinning and holding up 6 fingers for the photographers, he embodied a truth that was becoming undeniable.
Japanese naval aviation was already dead.
What remained was merely the final convulsions of a system that had been shattered beyond recovery. The Hellcat pilots, operating under radar direction, in superior formations, against poorly trained opponents, destroyed aircraft at a rate that seemed almost impossible.
On June 19, 1944 alone, American pilots and shipboard anti-aircraft crews destroyed over 380 Japanese aircraft.
Japanese pilots, observing the catastrophe unfolding around them, reported destroying over 100 American aircraft.
Actual American losses were 23. The psychological dimension of that disparity could not be overstated. Japanese pilots entered combat expecting a reasonable fight.
Many returned to report that they had engaged American fighters and scored multiple kills. The reality, when assessed through radar records and actual losses, was profoundly different. They had perceived victory while experiencing wholesale destruction. This phenomenon became so consistent, so overwhelming, that American intelligence recognized it as a distinct psychological condition.
Intelligence officers named it zero fatigue, a recognition among Japanese pilots that encountering Hellcats was likely to result in death. Some pilots became psychosomatically ill, developing physical symptoms to avoid combat duty. Others completed their assigned missions but deliberately avoided engagement, returning to report contact without accomplishing anything. The fighting spirit that had characterized Japanese naval aviation in 1941 and 1942 was replaced by resignation and despair. The F6F Hellcat's victory at the Marianas Turkey Shoot was not accidental.
It was the inevitable result of a system designed specifically to overcome zero dominance through means that transcended individual aircraft performance or pilot skill. The Hellcat's fuselage incorporated 212 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot and vital systems. The Zero had abandoned armor entirely to maintain weight and maneuverability. A single burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire that would ignite a Zero's unprotected fuel tanks could punch through the Hellcat's armor and still exit through the fuselage without catastrophic damage.
American pilots could absorb punishment that would annihilate Japanese pilots.
The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns fired at 400 rounds per minute per gun.
The standard ammunition mix included incendiary rounds, tracer rounds, and solid rounds.
The concentration of firepower was overwhelming. Japanese aircraft, designed for minimum structural weight, disintegrated when hit with such concentrated fire. The Zero's lightweight construction was a severe liability when engaged with an aircraft carrying nearly twice the firepower.
The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine generated 2,000 horsepower in its baseline F6F3 configuration. Later F6F5 variants incorporated water injection systems that boosted power to 2,200 horsepower. This engine was reliable, powerful, and seemed almost immune to the logistical problems that plagued Japanese aircraft engines. American pilots could operate at high power settings continuously without fear of mechanical failure. Japanese pilots, flying engines that were marginally adequate for their airframes, operated under constant anxiety about engine reliability. But mechanical superiority alone did not account for the Hellcat's devastating effectiveness. The aircraft represented an entirely different philosophy of warfare. The Zero embodied the pre-industrial tradition of individual combat excellence. The pilot was supreme. The aircraft was a tool, important, certainly, but ultimately secondary to the skill of the man in the cockpit. This reflected a military culture that valued personal excellence, warrior spirit, and the aesthetic of the perfect maneuver. The Hellcat embodied industrial-age warfare. The pilot was valuable primarily as an operator of a system. What mattered was production capacity. What mattered was the ability to produce thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of pilots operating under systematized procedures. What mattered was radar guiding fighters to intercept points with mathematical precision. What mattered was the ability to manufacture replacement aircraft at rates that exceeded losses multiple times over. American industrial capacity was crushing Japanese military capacity not through any single revolutionary technology but through the overwhelming application of multiple advantages that, individually, might have been surmountable but collectively created an unbridgeable chasm. American aircraft factories produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944. Japan, despite total national mobilization, produced only 28,000. The gap was not narrowing, it was widening. American pilot training was systematic and progressive. New pilots learned from standardized curriculum, progressed through recognized stages of development, and accumulated flight hours before entering combat. American pilot training produced consistent, reliable operators who knew how to follow procedures and execute tactics systematically. Japanese pilot training, once the most selective and rigorous in the world, had been ground into dust by the demands of replacement production. The system could not absorb replacement losses at wartime rates. The training structure, designed for a small elite force, could not scale to produce thousands of pilots annually. If the Hellcat represented American industrial capacity made manifest, then fuel represented the material abundance that sustained that capacity. American carriers operated with supplies of aviation fuel measured not in hundreds of gallons but in thousands of tons. American pilots trained for extended periods at full power, accepting high fuel consumption as a routine cost of combat operations. Japanese pilots, by contrast, flew aircraft that consumed fuel with urgency and operated under a constant anxiety about fuel availability. The Hellcat seemed to have unlimited endurance, approaching combat from any direction, fighting at will, retreating to sanctuary with fuel remaining. The Zero, by comparison, was always flying on the edge of its fuel envelope. Every extra maneuver consumed precious fuel. Every extended engagement risked stranding the pilot in the ocean with nothing but a raft between him and death. Fuel, in short, was the symbolic representation of the broader truth: American material abundance versus Japanese material scarcity. Every Hellcat that arrived in the Pacific Theater represented raw industrial output, factories humming with production, resources flowing without constraint, a nation fully mobilized for war and possessing the economic capacity to satisfy every requirement.
The zero, by comparison, represented a nation slowly strangling under the pressure of total war against opponents who possessed resources that seemed limitless. Among the thousands of Hellcat pilots who would fly the aircraft during the war, one man epitomized the machine's devastating potential. Captain David McCampbell, commanding officer of Fighter Squadron 15 aboard the USS Essex, would become the United States Navy's highest-scoring flying ace to survive the war.
McCampbell entered combat on May 14, 1944.
Over the following months, he would score 34 aerial victories, all of them achieved while flying the Grumman F6F Hellcat. McCampbell became legendary not for flashy maneuvers or displays of aerobatic skill, but for systematic execution of tactical doctrine. He flew with wingmen. He maintained formation discipline. He followed radar vectors to intercept points.
He executed attack procedures with methodical precision.
On June 19, 1944, during the Marianas Turkey Shoot, McCampbell achieved ace status in a single day, shooting down 5 Japanese Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers during his first combat sortie and 2 Mitsubishi Zeros during his second engagement.
On October 24, 1944, at the beginning of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell achieved something extraordinary.
He and his wingmen attacked a Japanese formation of 60 aircraft. McCampbell shot down 9 50s, 2 03s, and 2 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars.
His wingmen downed 6 more.
When McCampbell landed aboard the carrier, his 6 machine guns had precisely 2 rounds of ammunition remaining. His fuel gauges read empty. McCampbell received the Medal of Honor for both actions, becoming the only fast carrier task force aviator to be honored twice. But when historians interviewed McCampbell decades after the war, he did not emphasize his personal skill or bravery.
Instead, he praised the machine beneath him. "I can't say enough good things about the Grumman Hellcat F6F. It was an outstanding fighter plane.
It performed well, was easy to fly, and was a stable gun platform. But what I really remember most was that it was rugged and easy to maintain."
That assessment captured the Hellcat's essential character.
The aircraft was not revolutionary in any single dimension. It was not the fastest fighter in the world. It was not the most maneuverable. It was not the most heavily armed. But it was comprehensively superior in the dimensions that mattered.
It was fast enough.
It was maneuverable enough.
It was heavily enough armed.
It was durable. It was reliable.
It could be mass-produced at unprecedented rates.
Most critically, the Hellcat could be flown effectively by pilots of average skill.
The aircraft did not require genius, it required competence and the willingness to follow procedures.
That democratization of combat air superiority represented a revolutionary concept in warfare.
By late 1944, the transformation was complete.
Japanese pilot training had deteriorated to the point of catastrophe. Pilots were graduating with 40 hours of flying time total.
Some received only 90 hours before being assigned to operational squadrons to face American pilots with 500 hours of training. The gap was not merely deficiency, it was an unbridgeable chasm. A pilot with 40 hours of training simply could not execute basic maneuvers reliably.
The difficulty of flying an aircraft, of maintaining control and executing tactical maneuvers simultaneously, required hundreds of hours of practice to achieve automatic competence.
Japanese pilots were being sent to die against an enemy they literally did not possess the training to fight.
Japan possessed the industrial capacity to build excellent aircraft.
The Kawanishi and 1K Shirden entered service in late 1944.
In many respects, it was superior to the Hellcat, faster, more maneuverable, more heavily armed. But it entered service too late and in numbers too small to affect the war. And more critically, Japan lacked the capacity to train pilots to fly it effectively. The final irony of the Pacific Air War was that Japan's inability to replace its losses stemmed not from aircraft production but from pilot production.
Japan could have built more aircraft.
What Japan could not do was train more pilots. The training system had collapsed.
By war's end, Japan was reduced to using inexperienced pilots in kamikaze attacks. But the kamikaze was not a cultural choice reflecting Japanese warrior spirit. It was an admission that Japanese pilot training had failed so completely that pilots could no longer be trained to return from missions.
The logic was bitter. Training a pilot to fly an airplane into a ship required only a few weeks. Training a pilot to be a combat pilot required months or years. Japan no longer had months or years.
By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the numerical reality of the Hellcats' dominance had become undeniable.
The F6F Hellcat destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter aircraft.
The Hellcat lost 270 aircraft in aerial combat.
The kill-to-loss ratio was 19.3 to 1. Against the Mitsubishi Zero specifically, the ratio was 13 to 1. Against other Japanese aircraft types, the ratio remained consistently favorable. The Hellcat's pilots produced 305 Navy flying aces, more than any other single aircraft in the American arsenal. Among them was David McCampbell, whose 34 victories made him the Navy's all-time leading ace. The Hellcat had accounted for 75% of all United States Navy aerial victories during the war. In a war where control of the skies often determined which side's ground forces could maneuver freely and which side had to hug the earth in fear, this represented dominance that transcended mere combat statistics.
Production figures told the story with even greater clarity.
Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats in just over 2 years. Peak production reached 600 aircraft per month.
Each aircraft required 20,000 man-hours to construct.
Yet assembly lines achieved remarkable efficiency through standardization and streamlined manufacturing processes. Japan built approximately 6,000 Zeros over a longer period. The Zeros were built in multiple factories with inconsistent standards.
Production never achieved the efficiency of American assembly line manufacturing.
When the war ended, American aircraft carrier task forces operated with near impunity. Japanese air opposition, once the dominant force in the Pacific, had been reduced to occasional nuisance raids by pilots with minimal training in aircraft already becoming obsolete.
The F6F Hellcat was not the most beautiful fighter aircraft ever built.
Aesthetically, it could not match the graceful symmetry of the Zero or the shark-like profile of the Vought F4U Corsair. The Hellcat was purposeful, designed to accomplish specific objectives without embellishment or artistic consideration.
But when history looks at what the Hellcat meant, aesthetic questions become irrelevant. The Hellcat represented the triumph of a particular vision of warfare.
Not warfare as an expression of individual excellence or warrior spirit, but warfare as a systematic application of industrial capacity and procedural discipline. The Hellcat and the system that supported it, the radar-directed fighter control network, the assembly line pilot training, the industrial production capacity, together they represented a new form of military organization.
This new form did not value the exceptional individual.
It valued reliable, consistent performance by adequately trained operators.
It did not believe that warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantage.
It believed that material superiority, applied with systematic efficiency, would always prevail. In the context of 1943 to 1945, this philosophy proved correct. The Hellcat and the system it embodied crushed Japanese naval aviation not through dashing heroism or individual brilliance but through the relentless application of superior technology, superior tactics, and superior training.
Japanese pilots had laughed at the Hellcat when it first arrived.
Those laughter had ceased within months.
By 1945, Japanese pilots who encountered Hellcats often chose to flee rather than fight. The myth of warrior spirit's ability to transcend material disadvantage had been destroyed as completely as any shot-down aircraft. Yet there is another dimension to the Hellcat's meaning that transcends the military realm. The Hellcat represented American abundance.
Not merely military abundance, but material abundance itself. The 6 Browning machine guns. The 212 pounds of armor plate. The self-sealing fuel tanks. The redundant hydraulic systems. The generous internal volume that allowed pilots to carry the supplies they needed, these were not necessities. They were luxuries made possible by a nation that could afford to build machines that were not optimized to the edge of possibility but instead possessed margins of safety and capability. The Zero represented scarcity. Every ounce of weight mattered because production capacity was limited. Every design decision involved painful trade-offs. Fuel consumption had to be minimized because fuel supplies were constrained. Armor had to be eliminated because weight restrictions could not permit protection. The Hellcat and the Zero, in their fundamental design philosophies, embodied the economies that produced them.
American abundance was built into every rivet. Japanese scarcity was embedded into every design compromise.
In the end, the Hellcat did not destroy Japanese naval aviation through superior pilot skill or exceptional aircraft design. The Hellcat destroyed Japanese naval aviation because it represented the material reality of a nation that could afford abundance while its opponent faced relentless scarcity. The Hellcat represented not merely air superiority, but the triumph of industrial capacity over individual excellence. It represented the brutal truth that in modern warfare, the side that can produce thousands of adequate aircraft will always defeat the side that can produce hundreds of exceptional aircraft. This truth, learned in the Pacific skies in 1943 to 1945, would define military thinking for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond.
The Hellcat was freedom's machine not because it fought for freedom, though it did.
It was freedom's machine because it represented the material abundance that a free economy could generate when mobilized for war. A society that could afford 212 pounds of armor plate as standard equipment. A society that could build 12,275 aircraft in 30 months. A society that could train tens of thousands of pilots to operate those aircraft systematically and competently. Japanese pilots who laughed at the Hellcat's arrival had not yet comprehended what they were facing. They would understand soon enough. They would understand when the Hellcats arrived in their formations. They would understand when the armor-piercing rounds of 6 machine guns ripped through their aircraft. They would understand when they climbed toward the heavens and realized they could not match the Hellcat's altitude performance. Most bitterly, they would understand what it meant when they realized that for every Hellcat destroyed, American factories would produce 2 more.
For every American pilot lost, American training centers would graduate 2 more replacements. The Hellcat laughed last.
And that laughter echoed across the Pacific, proclaiming a new reality. In the industrial age, individual excellence had been replaced by systematic competence, supported by industrial abundance. And industrial abundance had proven all-powerful. The Hellcat was not the greatest fighter aircraft ever built. It was, however, the perfect fighter aircraft for an industrial age, reliable, abundant, deadly, and ultimately unstoppable.